There is a moment in automotive history when power consumption stopped being about practicality and started being about absolute obsession. When engineers looked at a problem and didn't ask whether they could solve it, but how much farther they could push beyond all reasonable limits. That moment crystallized on a racetrack in Berlin in 1934, and it reached its apex on a rain-slicked stretch of German Autobahn on a cold January morning in 1938. This is the story of the Auto Union Type C. And this is a machine that was quite literally ahead of its time by decades, not just in performance, but in philosophy, in approach, in the sheer, uncompromising nature of engineering ambition that defined an entire era of motor racing. When people talk about the golden age of Grand Prix racing, what they're really talking about is the era of the Silver Arrows, and more specifically, the duel between two German manufacturers locked in a battle that transcended sport and became something far more dangerous, more political, and ultimately far more tragic. To understand the Auto Union Type C, you have to understand the world it was born into. Germany, in 1933, was a nation rebuilding itself in the image of a new political order. Adolf Hitler, having seized power just months before, stood at the Berlin Motor Show in February of that year and made an announcement. Germany would dominate international motorsport. It would showcase German engineering superiority to the world. And to do that, the Nazi government allocated 500,000 Reichsmarks to motor racing subsidies. Not a huge sum, but significant enough to change everything. That money was initially claimed entirely by Mercedes-Benz, who had dominated European racing in the late 1920s and early 1930s. But a man named Baron Klaus von Oertzen, the chairman of Auto Union, knew a secret. He knew that if he could appeal directly to Hitler, if he could convince the Führer that competition between two German manufacturers would make them both better, that rivalry would showcase German superiority even more powerfully than monopoly ever could, then the subsidy would have to be shared. So von Oertzen, along with a factory driver named Hans Stuck, a man Hitler admired, went to meet the Führer. And they won. The 500,000 Reichsmarks would be split. Mercedes would get half. Auto Union would get the other half. And with that decision, one of the greatest rivalries in motorsport history was born. But Auto Union faced a problem. They had money now, but they didn't have a car. They needed an engineer, and Auto Union found the perfect man. His name was Ferdinand Porsche. Ferdinand Porsche was a man who didn't think like other engineers. In the 1920s, when conventional wisdom said engines belonged in the front of a car, Porsche had experimented with rear-mounted engines. He'd done it in motorcycles. He'd done it in private vehicles. He'd even attempted it in racing with limited success on a car called the 1923 Benz Tropfenwagen. But Porsche understood something that his contemporaries did not. Conventional front-engine racers had a fundamental problem. The weight of the engine was concentrated at the front, which meant the rear tires were lightly loaded, which meant the rear tires had little grip, which meant the car was always on the verge of sliding out in corners. Porsche's solution was radical. Put the engine behind the driver. Not in some wild, untamed way, but as part of a carefully architected design philosophy. Place the driver forward in the chassis. Put the fuel tank in the middle for central weight distribution. Mount the engine directly behind the driver. This way, weight would be distributed more evenly, front to rear. The center of gravity would be lower. The car would behave more predictably. The only problem was that nobody had ever built a racing car this way, and building one would require solving problems that didn't yet have solutions. When Ferdinand Porsche sat down to design the engine for this revolutionary new racing car, he knew it needed to be special. The 750-kilogram weight limit meant he couldn't just build a monster engine. He had to build the most efficient, most powerful engine possible within that constraint. What he created was nothing short of engineering genius. A 45-degree V16, two-cylinder banks angled at nearly 45 degrees to each other. Each bank had its own set of 8 cylinders. One central camshaft operated all 32 valves. The valve train was a marvel of engineering. Intake valves actuated through rocker arms connected directly to the camshaft. Exhaust valves operated through push rods that threaded through tubes above the spark plugs. This created 3 separate valve covers, an aesthetic signature that would become iconic. When the Type C arrived in 1936, the engine had been enlarged to its full 6-liter displacement. It produced 520 horsepower at 5,000 RPM, but this is where things get extraordinary. The car made 853 newton-meters, that's 872 foot-pounds, of torque at just 2,500 RPM. This wasn't a high-revving screamer. This was a torque-filled monster, a Roots supercharger with pressure up to 0.95 bar, force-fed fuel and air into those cylinders. And because this car was fueled by a secretive mixture of gasoline, ethanol, and methanol, not just regular fuel, the engine could operate at combustion pressures and temperatures that would have caused engine-knocking failure in ordinary fuel. This engine could produce wheel spin at 150 miles per hour. Not cautious wheel slip, not minor wheel spin. Violent, wheel-spinning acceleration at speeds that would keep today's hypercars pinned to the tarmac. The sound this thing made was legendary. Drivers and observers described it as the most tremendous exhaust note ever heard from a racing engine, a howling, roaring, spine-chilling symphony that marked its arrival from miles away. But here's where the genius turned into a nightmare. A 520 horsepower engine in a car that weighed less than 1,650 pounds, mounted directly behind the driver in a chassis that was stiff with suspension geometry that wasn't quite understood, created something that was almost undrivable at the limit. The independent suspension was advanced for its time. Torsion bars and trailing arms at the front, a swing axle system at the rear, wishbones and transverse leaf springs completing the package. But the 60% of the car's weight sitting on the rear axle meant that when you accelerated hard in a corner, the inside rear wheel would light up with wheel spin, even at speeds well over 100 miles per hour in dry conditions. The oversteer was extreme. A driver could induce wheel spin at 150 miles per hour. The car would snap sideways with terrifying speed. Only a handful of drivers in the world had the skill, the reflexes, and quite frankly, the bravery to control this machine at the limit. In corners, the car would twist unpredictably. The forward driving position made it worse. Early versions of the Type C would literally try to flip or tumble into oversteer situations. Auto Union addressed this by developing one of the first limited slip differentials for racing use, a ZF unit that partially locked the axle and prevented the inside wheel from spinning quite so violently. It helped. But it didn't fix the problem. It just made the car manageable enough for elite drivers to survive with the throttle pinned. Engineers at Auto Union ran countless tests. They recorded engine revolutions on paper discs, studying the data to understand how the car behaved. They worked the problem methodically. But when you have a chassis that's comparatively rigid for the era, a mid-engine placement that concentrates weight wrongly as fuel burns down, an engine making almost incomprehensible amounts of torque at low revolutions, and tires that are narrow by today's standards with soft construction and mediocre grip, you're going to have a difficult car. That was the Type C. By 1936, Auto Union had found a driver who could exploit this dangerous machine better than anyone else in the world. His name was Bernd Rosemeyer. He was just 26 years old, blonde, dashingly handsome, and possessed of a reputation for bold, sometimes reckless driving that had made him famous throughout German motor racing circles. Rosemeyer had come up through the ranks of German racing, building his reputation on circuits and in hill climbs. Auto Union saw his potential and signed him, and in 1936, with the Type C finally reaching its full potential, Rosemeyer proceeded to introduce the world to a level of driving mastery that seemed almost superhuman. He won 5 of Auto Union's 6 victories that year. 5. He became European champion in 1936 at an age when most drivers are still learning their craft. Rosemeyer drove the Type C as if he and the machine were one entity. Where other drivers fought the car, Rosemeyer anticipated its movements. Where other drivers gripped the wheel and hung on, Rosemeyer danced with the machine. Contemporary accounts describe him as barely containing the car, always on the edge of disaster, but somehow always in control. The legend grew. In 1937, Rosemeyer won the Vanderbilt Cup in America. He won the European Championship again. He and the Type C seemed invincible. Alongside Rosemeyer, Auto Union had other remarkable drivers. Hans Stuck, the King of the Mountains, a supremely talented racer who had first caught Hitler's attention and helped secure the racing subsidy. Achille Varzi, an Italian driver of exceptional skill. And perhaps most remarkably, Tazio Nuvolari, the legendary Ferrari driver who drove for Auto Union in 1938. Nuvolari was perhaps the greatest driver of the era, and even he found the Type C a handful. Only he, Rosemeyer, and to a lesser extent Stuck, could truly extract the machine's full potential. These three drivers transcended the machine. They didn't just drive the Type C, they tamed it. They pushed it to limits that mere mortals couldn't reach. Rosemeyer in particular was becoming something more than a driver. He was becoming a national hero. He was the face of German technical achievement, and that made what happened next even more tragic. The rivalry between Auto Union and Mercedes-Benz in the 1930s was unlike anything in motorsport before or since. It was national prestige, it was Nazi propaganda. It was two industrial titans locked in a battle where losing meant losing favor with Hitler himself. Both companies were building Silver Arrows, sleek aluminum-bodied, silver-painted racing cars that looked like nothing else on Earth. Both were powered by supercharged engines producing unprecedented horsepower, but they approached the problem differently. Mercedes stuck with conventional front-engine design. Their 1934 W25 was revolutionary, but it was revolutionary in the traditional sense. Mid-engine Auto Union, meanwhile, was revolutionary in a completely different way. The 1936 season belonged to Auto Union. Rosemeyer's victories, the Type C's dominance, the sheer technical sophistication of Porsche's design. It all came together. Mercedes had a disappointing year. The rivalry would truly intensify in 1937. Mercedes introduced the W125, a fearsome machine powered by an 8-cylinder, 5.6-liter engine producing over 600 horsepower. The Type C, despite all its engineering sophistication, couldn't match that output. The W125 was faster in a straight line, but on road courses, over a full Grand Prix distance, the battle was competitive. Rosemeyer won 4 Grand Prix races in 1937 against the Mercedes W125. It was warfare. Caracciola versus Rosemeyer, Mercedes versus Auto Union, Germany versus Germany, with Hitler watching. The propaganda machine cranked up. Radio broadcasts covered the races as if they were military campaigns. Newspapers printed lap-by-lap accounts. The races mattered in a way that transcended sport. Every victory was national victory. Every defeat was national shame. And in that atmosphere of hyper-nationalism, these machines pushed harder and harder. They went faster. They took more risks. The cars demanded more of their drivers. And the drivers, caught up in the patriotic fervor, were willing to give everything. Let me walk you through the numbers, because the numbers tell the story. In 1936, the Type C competed in 12 Grand Prix races. Auto Union won 6 of them. Mercedes managed only 1 victory that year, a disappointing result for the team that had dominated in previous seasons. Rosemeyer personally won 5 of those 6 victories. He was crowned European champion. He set records. He broke records. He won hill climbs. He dominated every form of racing that the Type C attempted. But racing results alone don't capture the true picture. This car was so far ahead of its competition in some aspects that victory seemed almost inevitable when everything fell into place. In 1937, while Mercedes had improved dramatically with the W125, the Type C continued to prove itself. Rosemeyer won the prestigious Vanderbilt Cup in America, proving that Auto Union's dominance wasn't confined to European circuits. He won multiple Grand Prix races. He set speed records. He became a legend. When you look at the complete record, between 1934 and 1938, Auto Union racing cars entered 61 racing events. They won 24 of them. They took 23 second-place finishes and 17 third-place finishes. In 1936 and 1938, an auto union driver was crowned German road racing champion. The car that was radical, that was different, that broke all the rules and flew in the face of conventional design, proved itself to be the most successful racing car of its generation. It wasn't just winning races, it was revolutionizing how racing cars were designed. Within a decade, every racing car in the world would use a mid-engine layout. Ferdinand Porsche had been vindicated, but not yet. First, there was one more chapter to this story, and it would be written not on a racetrack, but on a stretch of German autobahn. In 1937, Nazi Germany undertook one of the most ambitious automotive publicity stunts ever attempted. They created Speed Week, a head-to-head competition between Mercedes and Auto Union to break the world land speed record. Not on a closed circuit, not in the safety of a controlled environment, but on a newly constructed section of the Autobahn, the German highway system, between Frankfurt and Darmstadt. Both companies built special streamlined versions of their racing cars. Mercedes prepared a hyper-streamlined W125 variant. Auto Union prepared an equally exotic Type C streamliner. These weren't racing cars anymore. They were speed records incarnate. The Auto Union Type C streamliner was fitted with a specially prepared 6.3-liter V16 engine producing 545 horsepower. The body was completely enclosed in a teardrop-shaped streamlined shell. No wheels visible, no driver visible. Just a smooth, silvery torpedo pointing down the Autobahn. The first attempt at the record was made by Mercedes driver Rudolf Caracciola. He was already a legend, multiple-time European champion, a supremely skilled driver. On his first run, Caracciola hit 268 miles per hour. That was the new world land speed record. Mercedes was leading 268-0, and Auto Union's chance would come. Bernd Rosemeyer volunteered for the attempt. Here was a 26-year-old driver at the absolute peak of his career, in a machine that was on the very edge of aerodynamic stability, attempting to break the world land speed record. To beat the man who had been his rival for 2 years, to win for his country, to cement his legend, and he very nearly did. On a warm-up run, Rosemeyer hit 268 miles per hour, matching Caracciola. His next run would be the record-setting attempt. The conditions were perfect, or so it seemed. On January 28, 1938, at 11:47 in the morning, on a closed section of the Frankfurt-Darmstadt Autobahn, Bernd Rosemeyer was making his final run for the land speed record. The car was performing perfectly. The engine was running beautifully. Rosemeyer was probably doing somewhere north of 268 miles per hour, possibly approaching 270. And then, something went wrong. The exact cause has been debated for decades. Some say a crosswind caught the car. Some say an aerodynamic instability at that speed caused the tail to become unstable. The car veered to the left, then suddenly to the right. It skidded. The driver, even at those speeds, despite his extraordinary skill, couldn't control it. The streamlined Auto Union shot off the roadway. The car hit the center median dividing the Autobahn. Then, with catastrophic violence, it hit the bridge embankment on the opposite side of the road. The impact was stupendous. The streamlined body crumpled, and Bernd Rosemeyer, thrown from the machine at something close to 270 miles per hour, died at the roadside. Just 10 weeks before, his wife had given birth to their son, Bernd Jr., whom he would never meet. Rosemeyer was 28 years old. He had been at the absolute peak of his career. He was on the threshold of immortality. And in an instant, in the blink of an eye, in the span of a few meters on a stretch of German highway, he was gone. The world's fastest racing driver became the world's first land speed record victim. Back in Berlin, when the news reached Auto Union and the racing establishment, it was as if the breath had been sucked from the room. Rosemeyer had been the face of Auto Union. He had been the symbol of German technical superiority. He had been the future, and now he was dead. Caracciola's record stood at 268 miles per hour. Rosemeyer's final legacy was that he had matched it and then given his life trying to exceed it. The land speed record war between Mercedes and Auto Union had claimed its price, and it would continue to claim prices. What the Auto Union Type C represented was a fundamental reimagining of how racing cars could be built and designed. The mid-engine layout, which seemed radical and almost ridiculous in 1934, became the standard template for all racing cars within 2 decades. Not immediately. In the 1940s and early 1950s, front-engine cars still dominated. But a British team named Cooper Car Company began experimenting with putting engines in the middle of their cars. By the late 1950s, the Cooper 500 and later the Cooper Climax had proven conclusively that mid-engine was faster. By the 1960s, every Grand Prix car in the world had an engine behind the driver. Ferdinand Porsche's controversial decision in 1934 had become universal doctrine. Beyond Grand Prix racing, the Type C's DNA would flow through all of Porsche's subsequent designs. The 550 Spider, one of the greatest sports cars ever built, was mid-engine. The 914, born from a collaboration with Volkswagen, was mid-engine. The Boxster, the Carrera GT, all mid-engine. The philosophy that Porsche had articulated for the Type C became the cornerstone of the Porsche company for the rest of its existence. It has been copied by every supercar manufacturer on Earth: McLaren, Ferrari, Lamborghini. They all use mid-engine layouts now because Ferdinand Porsche proved it was superior in a 1930s racing car that was almost impossible to drive. The technological lineage is unbroken from the Auto Union Type C of 1936 to the Ferrari SF90 of today and to the electric supercars of tomorrow. The Auto Union Type C, in other words, didn't just dominate its era. It set the template for all racing car design that followed. Every single car that has won a Formula One championship in the past 60 years owes a debt to Ferdinand Porsche's radical decision to build a mid-engine racing car in the early 1930s. When we look back on the Auto Union Type C from our vantage point in the 21st century, we see a machine that was extraordinary in almost every way. It was powerful beyond the understanding of the time. It was innovative far beyond its competitors. It was driven by men of exceptional skill and incredible bravery, and it was intimately connected to one of the darkest periods in human history. That's the complication at the heart of this story. The Auto Union Type C was the product of genius, Ferdinand Porsche's genius as an engineer, and the genius of everyone at Auto Union who built and developed the car. But it was also the product of Nazi Germany's desire to showcase technological superiority to the world. The 500,000 Reichsmarks that funded the car came from a regime that was busily committing unspeakable atrocities. The propaganda value that Auto Union derived from Rosemeyer's victories was used by Goebbels and Hitler to reinforce nationalist narratives. The deaths of racing drivers like Rosemeyer were glamorized in newspapers that also printed the regime's horrific ideology. The Auto Union Type C sits at the uncomfortable intersection of human engineering brilliance and political evil. It represents the fact that extraordinary machines and extraordinary people can be born in ordinary times and in extraordinary circumstances, good and bad, intertwined. Bernd Rosemeyer was a brilliant driver who will forever live in legend. Ferdinand Porsche was a revolutionary engineer whose philosophy transformed motorsport. But the car they created together and the era in which they created it are inseparable from the darkness of that time. And maybe that's the most important lesson. The Auto Union Type C teaches us that engineering brilliance doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the world, it exists in politics, it exists in history. Great machines don't emerge from nowhere. They emerge from great passion, yes, but also from great obsession, from nationalism, from the desire to win at any cost, from the willingness of men to push themselves and their machines beyond all reasonable limits, knowing that the risk is death. The Auto Union Type C produced speeds and performances that shocked the world. It proved that a radical design philosophy could work better than conventional wisdom. And it exacted a terrible human price. The machine itself still exists, in museums, in private collections, in replicas. It can still be heard roaring to life, That magnificent V16 engine producing sound that hasn't changed in nearly 90 years. And every time that engine starts, every time that silver torpedo howls down a track, we're reminded of a moment in history when Germany's engineering genius and Germany's political madness were indistinguishable. When a race car was more than just a race car. When speed and power and innovation carried within them the seeds of tragedy. The Auto Union Type C remains, as it has always been, a zero fighter on wheels,